And we're, of course, at the start of this 10-day high holiday period. The high holidays are referred to also as the days of awe, A-W-E, and the days of judgment. And really, in the Torah itself, Rosh Hashanah is referred to as Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. And that's a pretty weighty idea. And it struck me, and strikes me still, that concept of sitting in judgment feels very appropriate for our current moment. Why? Because sitting in judgment is a passive act. You're sitting there in this metaphor. This is a metaphor that also, according to our tradition, and many of you might believe as well, is also elements of mystical truth, that it might be that today, indeed and in fact, we are being judged by God. Very difficult theological idea. But regardless, there's this aspect of passivity, that we are sitting here. We're sitting. You're sitting. I'm standing. But we're sitting, being judged. And what can you do about that? Nothing. You just have to sit there. And you're being judged, you are the object. And someone else is the subject. And you're being acted upon. And you can't do anything. You sit there. That's this metaphor, this paradigm of the Day of Judgment. And of course, this last Jewish year and the last year and a half all over the world has been a moment where we have deeply felt like the world is acting on us. The world is acting on us. And there's not so much you can do about it. We sit there, and regarding COVID, we follow the rules, and we read the news, and for many months we did not leave our homes, or left briefly. And if you're a Penn student, you didn't get to go to school for a long time. And then if you're not a freshman, then you came back and you could be on campus but still couldn't go to class, and still really for the last year and a half had to sit there. I'm using the word had to sit there broadly, meaning yes, sometimes we stood and we walked and we went for walks and we walked our dogs, etc. But really the experience of the last year and a half was one of passivity and being on the receiving end of the events of the world happening to us. It's not, of course, was not just COVID. We don't have to scratch very deeply to go down the laundry list of other things happening in the world. Just in the last month, just the last month we could sit here and just think about and feel into the last month, the end of America's longest war ever, and the insanity and surrealism of some of the images coming out of that moment and out of the last 20 years. And I'll speak personally, again, a feeling of deep inability to act in a way that is at all meaningful. That might be a little unfair. There are maybe some things we can do with Afghan refugees, etc. So there's world politics, there's American politics, and the deeply broken nature of so many elements of our socio-political conversation, which can also feel deeply marginalizing and like there's very little that we can do about that. And then in the last 2 weeks, sitting here watching the effects of climate change just ravage the world, fires on the West Coast, what happened in Louisiana. Some of you know that before coming to Penn, I was a congregational rabbi in New Orleans for 5 years, so I am particularly sensitive to what's happening down there. And then in Philadelphia and New Jersey. Yes, we also love New Jersey. It's at our doorsteps. It's here. And it's happening to us. The theme of being the objects and having things happen to us by an external subject, an external actor, I think is best summed up in the Machzor, in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, in the prayer service, by a repeating theme wherein God is a shepherd and we are God's flock. And we're referred to, and in a moment when we turn to the Musaf service, you'll see it explicitly in the Unatana Tokef prayer. We are referred to as sheep. We're sheep that walk under God's staff, I think, and God counts us and herds us. There's a nice element of that imagery which is loving, but at its core, we're sheep. Sheep being, I think, in contemporary lexicon, the image of what you'd call lemmings, followers, people that do what they're told. Still today, you hear in American politics and in social media, people that follow blindly what their leaders tell them are seen as sheep. If you follow the anti-vax movement, as I like to do because I'm a masochist, the one thing that people will use is calling people sheeple, right? People who are like sheep. Sheeple, who just blindly follow the words of scientists and politicians. So sheep, in our parlance today, is not a good thing to be called. And yet our tradition is sitting here saying, indeed, we are sheep, which is a very stark articulation of this notion of being passive objects to external actors. Which leaves us then with the question of, is that really what our tradition best has to offer us? That indeed a sort of resigned, what are you going to do? Which I think, if you'll agree with me, there is something in our tradition that's Jewish about that. This kind of man plans and God laughs. That really, yes, it's all up to God. It's all up to use a mixed metaphors, it's all up to fate and luck, and it is what it is, and all we can do is sigh and accept it. Is that really what our tradition best has to offer us? No. The answer is no. That same Unatana Tokef prayer that we're going to get to in the Musaf service actually says, no, there are 3 things that you can do, according to the Unatana Tokef, which allow or cause the divine decree to be torn up. Now again, we don't have to get into the theology of that God is making a decree and we can get God to. That's fascinating and I think difficult, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. But I understand that to mean there's 3 things that we can do which allow us to get away from this paradigm, from this understanding that we're just sheep, that it all happens to us, and that there's nothing we can do about any of these things. 3 pieces of advice our tradition gives us that if we follow can help us shift in this next year from the position of the object, of the sheep, to the position of the subject, to really being authors of our own experience in this year to come. So what are these 3 pieces of advice that our tradition offer us? They're in Hebrew, but then I'll translate them. And it's in the Unatana Tokef, in Musaf. Utshuva, which I'll translate later, but roughly translates to repentance. Utfila, again, which translates to prayer, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Tshuva, tfila, and, does anyone know the third? Tzedakah, charity, loosely. Let's get into all those 3, and then I'll conclude. Tshuva, tefillah, utzdaka. Tshuva. Tshuva often is translated as repentance, which in a very narrow meaning means you did something wrong and you try to fix it. So if you hurt someone, this is how we talk about it with my kids, is you made him unhappy. So now you have to apologize. But then, of course, when you tell an 8-year-old to apologize, what do they say? I'm sorry. So then we have to say, no, okay, you can't just say I'm sorry. You have to actually try to mean it and feel it and ask what you can do to make it better and try to understand. So we're working through that. And to any parents, I'm open to suggestions after services. So that's the narrow understanding of tshuva, saying you're sorry and trying to fix it. But in a broader sense, our sages understand tshuva to mean, well, the root word of teshuvah is lashuv, which means to return. So tshuva in a deeper sense means returning. What are you returning to? Returning to ourselves. Returning to our highest and best way of being in the world. Returning to those things that when we are doing them or feeling them or acting on them, we feel and know that we are our best selves. Having spoken with many students during the pandemic, and many people, for many of us, it was such a radical shift and change from our lives as we had been living them that we gave up or stopped doing things that we had done prior that brought us joy, that brought us peace, that brought us calmness, that brought us stillness. People also adopted new things. Baking bread seems to have been a popular one, etc. I feel like baking bread is a good stand-in for everything. And people talk about that, the new things they started doing. People got puppies. Any new dog owners, COVID puppy owners? See one in the back, and Jenna knows that I also am one of those. But I don't think we talk enough about what we stopped doing. And for each of us, an important tshuva that you need, our tradition tells us, to take on in the coming year is to think again about what are those things in your life. And these can be actions, these can be occupations, they can be hobbies, they can also be they can be behaviors, ways that you are in relationships, ways that you are with your parents, your siblings, your friends, that you stopped being, either suddenly or slowly but surely. And to commit and to say, no, I know what it is in myself, in my life, that is my highest priority or priorities. I know what it is in my own belief system that I deeply believe in and have gotten away from, and said, oh, it's okay, it's the pandemic, I don't really have to. It's kind of like a no man's land. It's like a free zone. I'll just wait to do that again until the pandemic is over. Well, no, it's been a year and a half. Things that we put aside, relationships that we didn't tend to, self-care, wellness, mental health activities that we did not attend to because we thought, I can put that off. So our tradition tells us, do tshuva. Return to those pieces of ourselves that we know encourage our highest and best selves. That's tshuva. Tefillah, which often translates as prayer. So we're about to enter into the rest of the Rosh Hashanah service, and then we have the rest of the 10 days of the high holidays, and then Yom Kippur. And indeed, there are people for whom traditional prayer is what? Effective, meaningful, powerful, connecting. And for those of you for whom that is true, you should have some powerful prayer and davening experiences over the next day, 10 days, and year to come. Powerful prayer experiences. But for those of you for whom prayer and tefillah traditionally is not a meaningful source of connection and inspiration and spirituality and growth, well, tefillah traditionally simply means crying out. And in fact, we saw that in the Haftorah reading just now. Hannah, before at the end of the Haftorah, she gives a poet, she authors a poem. But before that, she cries out wordlessly. And that also is prayer. That is tefillah. Tefillah is giving voice to what hurts you, is giving voice to what you see that is wrong in the world. So if you find yourself at home or in your dorm and you're, I believe the term is doom scrolling, which for the uninitiated simply means looking at all the terrible news or other people's posts, social media, or anywhere you get your news of the outside world. It's so easy to just let that wash over you wave after wave and feel terrible. And we're all guilty of that. I certainly am. What it means when our tradition tells us that we should lean into tefillah is to make sure that we have outlets to name what is wrong, to cry out, to say to ourselves, to our friends, to our families, to our communities, this is not okay, this hurts me, this pains me. To take time to make sure that we're crying, that we're feeling the sadness and the brokenness of what's happening, and not just sit there and become numb to it, which is so easy to do. And in some ways you might think is actually it can feel like that's actually the appropriate response. There's so much, you have to just become numb to it. How else can you deal with it? Says our tradition that mindset, the mindset of becoming numb to how much is wrong, that itself is the sheep paradigm. And that to grab the year by its horns. We have to allow ourselves to feel. Don't become numb. Feel, cry out, and name what's wrong. That is tefillah. Tshuva, tefillah, and lastly, tzedakah. And tzedakah, which traditionally just means charity. That's a cringe at that translation. Tzedakah means justice. And looking at the world and what is wrong with the world and saying, I want to make the world a more just place. Easier said than done. Why is that easier said than done? Because this goes back to what I just said. There's so many. Where are you going to start and what are you going to do? Some of you have heard the term analysis paralysis, which means you can look at these issues for so long. There's so many of them. How to get involved, why to get involved, which one to get involved. You end up not getting involved. So the tradition tells us, sorry, you got to do it anyways. And the advice around tzedakah is don't worry about attacking everything. Make sure in this year to come that there is one issue, one, that you educate yourself about, that you educate others about, that you give money towards, that you try to support and make better. And so that in 1 year from now, when we're here, please God, with masks off and sitting closer together, we can look back and say, okay, I had that one area of tzedakah really covered this last year. And while we're on the topic, I would be remiss if I did not give a quick shout out. And this is to folks who think about supporting organizations during the year. And especially, this is also to folks who are watching and listening at home, that I want to raise up Penn Hillel as one such organization that you can think about supporting. This is, of course, for all the reasons, shaping up to be a difficult year. Just from the high holidays itself, this is a major time where we fundraise for our operations throughout the year, and having fewer attendees than in past years, and also having additional costs for live streaming and supporting students who are not currently on campus or want to have meals but not come to the building, and we support meals across campus. So this is when you're thinking about your tzedakah opportunities for the year to come, I really wanted to raise up Penn Hillel in that vein with all the incredible work that we're doing. And if you're interested and want to talk more about that, please come see me after. Tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah. 3 important pieces of advice that our tradition give us to make sure that this next year moves us out of the sheep, out of the just sitting there, out of the being the object model, into a year of being a subject, being an author, authoring our own stories, grabbing this year, 5782, by the horns and saying, I am going to act this year and help make this be a good, sweet, happier, healthier, and more just new year. So I will wish you a Shana Tova, and we're going to transition now to the shofar service. Is Olivia, the woman of the hour, will join us on stage. Our intrepid shofar blower, when Cantor Emma could not attend, we searched far and wide, and Olivia answered the call for a shofar blower. We are on page